The Bible hit the dirt floor of the Harrow Creek Sheriff's office with a sound like a gunshot, and Lillian Wells did not flinch. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her spine rigid as a fence post, and she stared at the man across the battered desk with eyes that had already cried themselves dry somewhere in the 600 miles between St. Louis and this God-forsaken stretch of Wyoming territory. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Briggs with a mustache that drooped like a wilted flower, looked from the Bible to her face and back again, as though deciding which of the two might cause him more trouble. The book lay open on the floor. Its spine was cracked, its pages yellowed at the edges, and tucked inside the front cover was a folded letter that had been read so many times the creases had become tears. Lillian watched Briggs's eyes drift toward that letter, and something inside her chest locked shut like a vault. "That letter names a man," Briggs said. "He did not pick the Bible up. Says he owes a debt." "The letter is private," Lillian said. Her voice was level. She had practiced levelness the way other women practiced needlework. "Miss Wells," Briggs leaned back in his chair, which screamed in protest. "This is 1882. You are a woman traveling alone in Harrow Creek, Wyoming, with nothing but a carpet bag and a Bible, claiming your mother's land grant is valid and that somebody stole from her. Now, I'm not saying you're lying. I'm saying that before I can do anything useful, I need to know who wrote that letter." The name inside that letter was the same name that had nearly broken her before she ever left Missouri. It was the same name carved into the top corner of the land deed her mother had pressed into her hands 2 weeks before dying of fever, and it was the same name that would either save Lillian or destroy her entirely. She had not planned to cry. She had promised herself she would not. But her hands were shaking as she bent down and picked the Bible up from the floor, and when she straightened, Sheriff Briggs was watching her with something that might have been pity, which she found far worse than hostility. "I'll tell you what's inside it," she said quietly, "when I find someone worth telling." She did not know then that the someone worth telling was already riding toward town, trailing a dust cloud and a reputation, with a letter of his own tucked into his coat pocket that connected him to her mother's name in ways neither of them could have imagined. But to understand why Stephen Finley rode into Harrow Creek that afternoon, and why the sight of a woman standing outside the sheriff's office with a Bible pressed to her chest would rearrange every careful plan he had spent 3 years building, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to Missouri, and to a woman named Clara Wells, and to the last thing she ever asked of her daughter before the fever took her for good. Clara Wells had been a schoolteacher before she was anything else. She had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, married a surveyor named George Wells in 1859, and followed him west to Missouri when the territories were promising, and land was something a family could build themselves into. George had surveyed quarter sections, filed claims, drawn maps for other men's futures, and somewhere in that work he had come across a parcel in Wyoming territory, 700 acres of grass and river bottom near a settlement called Harrow Creek, that he believed would be worth something one day. George Wells had died in the winter of 1873, not from anything dramatic or Western, just a fall from a horse on an icy road outside Jefferson City. He left Clara with 14-year-old Lillian, a surveyor's kit, $200 in a bank account, and a land deed for 700 acres in Wyoming that he had filed through a territorial land office and paid for with the savings he had kept hidden under a floorboard for 6 years. Clara kept the deed in her Bible. She kept it because she believed in the land the same way she believed in Scripture, with a faith that did not require her to have seen it with her own eyes. For 9 years after George died, Clara taught school in Jefferson City, and Lillian grew up beside her, learning letters and arithmetic, and the particular quiet discipline of a woman who had accepted that life would not be easy and had decided to be useful anyway. Lillian learned to read Latin from her father's surveying texts. She learned to ride from a neighbor boy who no longer remembered teaching her. She learned to keep her feelings sealed behind a composed face, because she had watched her mother do it every single day and assumed it was the only dignified way to survive loss. In the spring of 1882, Clara's lungs began to fail. The doctor said it was consumption, said it quietly, the way doctors said things that had no remedy. Clara lasted through April and into May, and in the second week of May she called Lillian to her bedside, took the Bible from her nightstand and pressed it into her daughter's hands. "The deed is inside," Clara said. Her voice was already thin by then, scraped down to something barely above a whisper. 700 acres on the Powder River branch south of Harrow Creek. Your father paid for it honestly and registered it properly. It belongs to us. Lillian had held the Bible with both hands. Then why haven't we ever gone there? Because I was afraid. Clara's eyes, still sharp even when the rest of her was fading, found her daughter's. I wrote to the land office 2 years ago asking about the parcel's current status. The man who wrote back said there was a dispute, said a rancher had been running cattle on it for a year already, claiming the deed was fraudulent. The word fraudulent had hit Lillian like a slap even in memory. "Is it fraudulent?" she had asked. "No." Clara's voice had sharpened for a moment, clear as a bell. "Your father was the most honest man I ever knew. That deed is real. The registration number is right there in the front cover. What is not honest is whoever told the land office otherwise." There was a letter in the Bible too, the one Briggs had tried to read. Clara had written it herself 3 months before she died, when she still had enough strength to hold a pen. It was addressed to Lillian, and it named, with the precision of a woman who had been a schoolteacher for 20 years, the man she believed had filed a false dispute against the Wells land grant. His name was Aldous Crane. He ran cattle in Harrow Creek under the banner of the Crane Land and Cattle Company, which was the largest single operation in that part of Wyoming territory. He had arrived 4 years after George Wells filed his deed, had somehow obtained a copy of the filing records, and had then told the Territorial Land Office that the original deed had been acquired through a fraudulent survey, a lie elegant enough to confuse a distant bureaucrat and simple enough to enforce with the weight of money and hired guns. Clara's letter laid this out in careful, schoolteacher's handwriting, with dates and registration numbers and the name of the Jefferson City clerk who had filed the original deed and could verify it if anyone bothered to ask. Lillian had read the letter so many times she had it memorized. She had read it the night her mother died. She had read it on the train from Jefferson City to Cheyenne. She had read it on the stagecoach from Cheyenne to Harrow Creek, bouncing over ruts in a road that seemed designed to discourage anyone from arriving. She had $23, a carpet bag, her mother's Bible, and the kind of determination that women develop when grief leaves them nothing else. She had arrived in Harrow Creek on a Tuesday in June of 1882, and she had gone directly to the sheriff's office because that was the logical place to begin, and she had found Briggs, who was not corrupt exactly, but who was cautious in the particular way of men who worked in towns where one man owned most of the economy. She had told him what she had. He had looked at the Bible. He had looked at the letter. He had asked who wrote it. And she had said she would tell someone worth telling, which was the bravest and most foolish thing she had ever said, and she had walked out of the sheriff's office into the June heat of Harrow Creek, Wyoming, with her heart hammering and no plan at all. That was when Stephen Finley rode in. She noticed him because the horse was beautiful first, a tall bay with 3 white stockings, and the kind of easy, ground-eating stride that meant it had been ridden correctly for years. Then she noticed the rider, because even at 50 yards he carried himself differently than the men she had seen lounging outside the saloon. He sat straight without being stiff. He moved with the horse instead of against it. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with dark hair showing beneath the brim of a plain brown hat, and his coat was dusty from the road but well made. He drew up outside the general store and stepped down, and that was when he looked across the street and saw her. Later, Stephen would tell her that the first thing he thought when he saw her was that she looked like someone who had just survived something, and was deciding whether to survive what came next. He would say it was the way she held the Bible, not reverently like decoration, but practically like a weapon she had not yet decided how to use. At the time, standing in the street with the Wyoming sun on her face, Lillian simply watched him look at her, decided he was not a threat, and turned toward the hotel, which was a two-story building called the Harrow House that smelled of sawdust and old tobacco. She did not think she would speak to him again. She was wrong about that within 20 minutes. The hotel's front room doubled as a dining area, and the woman who ran it, a compact, no-nonsense German immigrant named Mrs. Bauer, served the evening meal at 6 o'clock regardless of who was hungry. Lillian sat at the long common table with 4 other guests, a traveling salesman from Denver, 2 brothers who were looking for work on a ranch, and Stephen Finley, who arrived exactly at 6 and took the chair across from her without appearing to notice she was there. Mrs. Bauer brought out a pot of beef stew, a basket of bread, and a pitcher of water, and for a few minutes the table was occupied with the business of eating. Then the salesman, who seemed constitutionally unable to endure silence, asked what business everyone was in. The brothers were in the business of kneading wages. The salesman sold agricultural implements. Then the salesman looked at Stephen. "Cattleman," Stephen said in the tone of someone who had answered that question 1,000 times. Finley, the older brother, sat up. "Not the Finley from Powder Creek." "Same. Heard you're the one been fighting the Crane operation for 3 years. The brother looked impressed. "Heard Crane offered to buy you out 6 times and you kept saying no." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Stephen's expression. He did not look at Lillian, but she had the distinct sense that he was aware of her in a way that had nothing to do with social politeness. "I keep saying no," he confirmed, and then he reached for the bread. The salesman looked at Lillian, apparently feeling it was her turn. "And yourself, miss?" "I'm here to establish a land claim," Lillian said. The table went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Stephen Finley looked at her then, and it was not the casual look of a man making small talk. It was the look of someone whose mind was working rapidly behind steady eyes. "What land?" he asked. 700 acres on the Powder River branch," she said, "south of town." He put down his bread. "Who are you?" "Lillian Wells." She met his gaze. "My father was George Wells. He filed a land grant on that parcel in 1869 through the Jefferson City Territorial Office. Someone in this county disputed the deed 4 years ago, and I intend to correct that." The salesman had stopped eating entirely. The brothers exchanged a look. Mrs. Bauer, who had come back to refill the water pitcher, went very still near the doorway. Stephen Finley looked at Lillian Wells for a long moment with an expression she could not read. Then he said, "George Wells was a surveyor out of Missouri. It was not a question." "Yes," she said very carefully. "I know that name," he said. "I know that deed." The dining room felt suddenly smaller. Lillian's hands were flat on the table on either side of her bowl. "How?" Stephen reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, smoothed it against the table, and turned it so she could read it. It was a copy of the original land grant survey. George Wells's handwriting was in the bottom corner, the same looping, careful script that Lillian had grown up seeing on lesson plans and letters. The registration number matched the one in her mother's Bible. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father gave it to a man named Ezra Hollies, who was a junior surveyor working with him in 1869. Ezra Hollies was my uncle. He died 2 years ago and left me his papers." Stephen's voice was quiet but absolutely steady. "I've been trying to find out who that deed belonged to for 8 months, because Aldous Crane told the land office that the original filer was dead with no heirs, and I had a feeling that was a lie." Lillian felt the room shift around her the way a room does when something enormous and irrevocable has just happened. "My mother died 3 weeks ago," she said. Something crossed his face that was not pity. It was something older and more specific than pity. It was the look of a man who had lost something himself and knew exactly the texture of that particular weight. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. The two brothers quietly excused themselves. The salesman followed. Mrs. Bauer retreated to her kitchen, and Lillian Wells and Stephen Finley sat across from each other in the empty dining room of the Harrow House Hotel, with a land deed between them and a silence that was somehow not uncomfortable, and looked at each other the way people look at each other when they begin to understand that their lives have been aimed at a collision they never saw coming. "He stole it from us," Lillian said. "Crane." "Yes," Stephen said. "He did." A pause. "He's been trying to steal from me for 3 years. Your land runs along the eastern edge of mine. Exit, he boxes me in. I lose access to the river for my cattle. So you have a practical reason to help me." "I do." He didn't look away. "That doesn't mean I won't." "I wasn't suggesting you shouldn't." She looked down at the survey copy on the table. "It means we want the same thing." "It means we want the same thing," he agreed. There was a quality in the way Stephen Finley spoke that Lillian found unexpected. He did not speak over her. He did not rush to fill silences. He said what he meant, and then he stopped, which was rare enough in a man that she registered it the way you register an unusual bird call, with sharp attention and a kind of wondering. She asked him about his ranch, because information was a practical necessity, and she needed to understand the landscape she had walked into. He told her it was called Powder Creek Ranch, that he had built it with a partner named Walt Gaines over 5 years, that Walt had died of a snakebite the previous summer, and that he now ran it with 2 full-time cowhands and seasonal help. She noticed he did not perform grief about Walt Gaines. He simply said he was gone, the way someone says the truth without needing to dress it up. She told him about her mother, about the school in Jefferson City, about the Bible and the deed and the letter that named Aldous Crane. She was more forthcoming than she expected to be, and she did not entirely understand why until later, when she would recognize that Stephen Finley had the specific gift of listening without agenda, which made truth easier than usual. When she mentioned the letter naming Crane, something hardened in his expression. Not anger, not exactly. More like a door closing over something much hotter than anger. "Crane has men," he said. "Real men, not hired decorations. He brought in 3 hands last year who used to work for a cattle baron in Texas who went to prison for intimidating homesteaders." "Is that meant to frighten me?" she asked. "It's meant to inform you," he said. "There's a difference." She appreciated the distinction. She told him so. He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "What do you plan to do tomorrow?" "Go back to the sheriff, show him the Bible and the letter, make him understand that the deed is valid and that Crane filed a false dispute. Briggs won't move against Crane without more than a letter and a deed copy. He's not corrupt, but he's cautious. Then we need more than a letter and a deed copy." He nodded slowly. "There's a territorial land commissioner in Cheyenne. His name is Howard Marsh. He has authority over disputed claims. If we file a formal challenge with him directly, Crane can't bury it the way he buried the original dispute." "We," Lillian said, noting the word. "If you want the help," he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp on the wall behind him made the shadows on his face specific and honest. He looked like a man who had been working outdoors his whole life and had not softened under it, but who had also not become hard in the way that men sometimes hardened into something that had no give left. "My mother's Bible has a registration number inside the front cover," she said, "and a letter she wrote naming Crane. And my father's signature on the deed itself, which matches the survey copy you have from your uncle's papers." She paused. "Together that might be enough." "Together," he said, and now the potential smile had become actual, brief and contained but real. "It might be." She went to bed that night with the Bible under her pillow, as she had every night since her mother died, and she lay awake listening to the sounds of Harrow Creek settling into night, the distant sound of the saloon, horses somewhere, wind off the open land to the north, and she thought about Stephen Finley's face when she had said her mother was dead 3 weeks ago. The specific knowing in his eyes. She wondered who he had lost and when, and then she wondered why she cared, and then she told herself she was tired and went to sleep. In the morning she found him already at the breakfast table, and he had clearly been up for hours. His hat was on the chair beside him, and he had a mug of coffee and a folded newspaper from Cheyenne that was 3 weeks old. And when she sat down, he looked up without ceremony and said, "I sent a wire to Howard Marsh's office last night. Told him we'd have a formal challenge filed by the end of the week." She stared at him. "You did that without asking me." "I did it before I had a chance to ask you," he said. "If I'd waited for breakfast, Crane would have had 12 more hours." He held her gaze. "If you want me to send a follow-up saying it was an error, I will." She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "No," she said, "don't." The corner of his mouth moved. "Good." Mrs. Bauer brought coffee and eggs, and they planned their next 3 days over breakfast with the focused efficiency of 2 people who had individually spent a lot of time solving problems alone, and had discovered, with some surprise, that solving problems together was faster and considerably less lonely. They went to the sheriff together that morning. This time with Stephen Finley standing at her shoulder, not in front of her, not speaking over her, but present in the way that shifted Briggs's calculation. The sheriff was more forthcoming. He looked at the Bible. He read the letter. He examined the deed registration number and the survey copy Stephen had. "I can't act on this alone," Briggs said, "but I won't block it either. You take this to Marsh and get a ruling, I'll enforce it." He looked at Lillian. "I want you to know, Miss Wells, that I knew Crane was sitting on disputed land. I just never had anyone show up with standing to challenge him." "You have one now," Lillian said. They spent the rest of that day with Stephen taking her out to see the land. They rode south from town on horses he had brought in from his ranch that morning, and when the land opened up before her, she stopped her horse on a low rise and simply looked. It was not dramatic country the way the mountains were dramatic. It was grass and sky, and the silver line of the Powder River cutting through the middle of it, cottonwoods along the banks with their leaves turning in the wind, and the long quiet of open land that felt like something you could breathe into your whole chest. Her father had walked this land. He had measured it with his chains and his theodolite and his careful eyes, and he had seen something worth keeping. She understood it now. She felt it the way you feel things that have been waiting for you. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Stephen had pulled up beside her without her noticing. He was looking at the land too, but she had the sense he was also watching her look at it, measuring her reaction with the careful attention he seemed to give to everything. "It borders mine on the north side," he said. He pointed. "That tree line is the beginning of Powder Creek Ranch. The river runs through both parcels." "My father knew that when he filed," she said. "He wrote in his surveying notes that the river access was the thing that made the land worth having." Stephen was quiet for a moment. "He was right." "Did you know him?" she asked. "Your Uncle Ezra, did he talk about my father?" "Ezra said George Wells was the best surveyor he'd ever worked with," Stephen said. "Said he had the kind of eye that saw land the way other people saw people, knew its character." He paused. "Ezra kept that survey copy because he thought the land was worth remembering." Lillian pressed her lips together and looked at the cottonwoods along the river. "My mother never saw it," she said. "She kept the deed in her Bible for 9 years, and she never came out here because she was afraid. And then she ran out of time." "She sent you," Stephen said. "Yes." Lillian turned to look at him. She did. He was closer than she expected, the horses having drifted together on the rise, and she could see his eyes clearly dark brown, with the kind of steadiness that came from looking at open country for a long time and from deciding, somewhere along the way, not to look away from difficult things. "She had good judgment," he said. It was a simple thing to say. It hit Lillian somewhere behind her sternum with a force that surprised her, and she looked away quickly, back at the river, because she was not ready to be undone by something kind. They rode back to town as the late afternoon light turned the grass gold, and the conversation between them shifted naturally through the practical and the personal the way conversation does when 2 people have made an unconscious agreement to be honest with each other. She learned that he had come to Wyoming from Indiana at 22, that he had spent 2 years as a ranch hand before buying his first 20 acres with Walt Gaines, that he had built the main house himself with Walt's help, and did not consider himself especially accomplished because of it, just persistent. She told him about teaching arithmetic to the younger students at her mother's school the past 2 years, about reading Latin in the evenings because it kept her mind busy, about the precise and specific silence of a house after someone dies in it, which is different from any other silence. He listened to all of it without filling the spaces she left, and she found herself saying more than she intended because the spaces invited it. That evening, sitting in the small front parlor of the Harrow house after dinner, with Mrs. Bower's lamp burning on the table between them and the Bible lying at Lillian's elbow, Stephen asked the question she had been both waiting for and dreading since the night before. "What does it say?" he asked. "Inside the cover. Your mother wrote something there." Lillian's hand went to the Bible. She did not open it immediately. "She wrote the registration number," she said, "and a note. It says George paid for this ground with 6 years of savings and an honest hand. It is ours. Never let anyone say otherwise." She looked up. Stephen's expression had gone very quiet. "And then there's the letter," she said. "You don't have to show me." "I know I don't." She opened the Bible to the front cover and took out the letter and held it for a moment. "The thing about this letter is that it is my mother's voice. She was a precise woman. Everything she meant is in it. And she is gone now. And this is the last precise thing she ever wrote. And I keep being afraid that if I show it to too many people, it will become a legal document and stop being her." It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone since her mother died. She had not planned to say it. She was not entirely sure why she had said it to him. Stephen looked at her across the lamplit table for a long moment. "Then tell me what it says," he said. Instead of showing it, she blinked. "What? Tell me, in your words, so it stays hers." Lillian sat with that for a moment. Then she set the letter down and told him what was in it, not reading it aloud, but rendering it from memory the way you render something you love, with attention to what mattered. Crane's name, the dates, the registration numbers, the Jefferson City clerk. Clara Wells's conviction, written in the schoolteacher's careful hand, that the deed was real and the dispute was manufactured and her daughter was capable of setting it right. Stephen listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Your mother was right about all of it." "I know," Lillian said. "I need a judge to know it too." "He will," Stephen said. "We have enough." She believed him. She was not sure she had believed a statement that directly from anyone in a long time, and she sat with the novel sensation of it while the lamp burned between them and the town quieted around the hotel's walls. "You said Crane has offered to buy you out 6 times, she said. 6 times, he confirmed. "What does he do when you say no?" A pause. "The first 3 times nothing. He accepted it as a negotiation. The 4th time 2 of my cattle were found with their throats cut. His voice was flat, not performatively calm, actually calm, which was somehow more serious. The 5th time my fence line along the eastern pasture was taken down in the night, and someone drove 40 head of Crane's cattle through my land and let them tear up the spring grass." A pause. "The 6th time was last month. He just offered money. I think he's changed his approach." "Why would he change his approach?" "Because someone told him I'd been asking about the Wells deed," Stephen said. "I think he knows I was looking for the original filer. I think he's trying to buy me out before I found one." The implication settled over Lillian like a cold shadow. "He knows I'm here," she said. "He will by morning," Stephen said. "Towns like this don't keep secrets for long." She pressed her hand flat on top of the Bible. "Then we need to move faster than he does." "I agree." Stephen leaned forward slightly. "I want to ride to Cheyenne, not wire ride. Bring the documents in person to Marcia's office and file the challenge with our hands." He held her gaze. "It's 3 days there and 3 days back. Crane won't expect us to move that fast." "All right," she said, without hesitation. He studied her. "You'd ride to Cheyenne with a man you met yesterday." "I'd ride to Cheyenne with the man who has my father's survey copy and an honest reason to help me," she said. "Whether I met you yesterday or 10 years ago makes no difference to the logic of it." Something moved in his eyes, something that was not entirely comfortable for either of them because it was beginning to mean something beyond logic. "We leave at first light," he said. They left at first light. Stephen brought 3 horses, 2 to ride and 1 carrying supplies, and he had clearly spent part of the night preparing because the supply horse was loaded with everything a 3-day ride required: food, bedrolls, a small canvas shelter, water in canteens, and a spare bridle. Lillian had her carpet bag and her Bible, which she had wrapped in a piece of oilcloth she bought from Mrs. Bauer's kitchen supplies the previous evening. The first day of riding was all business. They covered ground steadily, spoke when there was reason to, and were quiet when there was not. The land between Harrow Creek and Cheyenne was rolling and pale, sage and grass, and the occasional gully cut by spring runoff, and the sky over Wyoming was the particular blue that made you feel exposed and held at the same time. Lillian was a competent rider, having learned on Missouri farmland where the ground was softer and the distances shorter. Wyoming riding was different, longer rhythms, more attention to the horse because the ground was less forgiving. Stephen noticed early on that she sat her horse well and did not offer instruction, which she appreciated. They camped the first night beside a creek bed that still held enough water for the horses. Stephen built a small fire without fuss, cooked salt pork and hardtack, and handed her a tin plate with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who fed people when they were hungry and did not need credit for it. After they ate, sitting on their bedrolls with the fire between them and the enormous Wyoming dark pressing in from all sides, he asked her about Missouri. Not about Crane or the deed or the plan, but about what her life had been. She told him about the school, about the students she had taught, about reading in the evenings and the way winter came early in Jefferson City and buried everything in a quiet that was sometimes peaceful and sometimes stifling. "Did you want to stay?" he asked. "In Missouri, before all this." She thought about it honestly. "I wanted to want to stay," she said, "which is different. Missouri was familiar, my mother was there, the school was there, but there was something in me that had always felt landlocked by it, too many walls. And Wyoming," she looked at the dark above the fire, "Wyoming feels like there is room to become whatever you actually are," she said, "which is frightening and also something I think I needed." He was quiet for a while. The fire crackled. Somewhere far away a coyote called and fell silent. "When I came out here from Indiana," he said, "I thought I was looking for space, room to breathe. But what I found was that the space just made the things you were carrying more visible." He paused. "There's no crowded room to hide them in." "What were you carrying?" she asked. It was a forward question. She knew it as she said it, but he had a way of making forward questions feel natural. He looked into the fire for a long moment. "A family that didn't understand why I had to leave. A younger brother who was angry about it for years. The particular guilt of a man who follows what he needs to follow and hurts people in the process." "And the brother," she said, "is he still angry?" "No." Something in his expression relaxed slightly. "He came out to visit 2 years ago, saw the ranch. Understood something about it he hadn't before." A pause. "We write letters now." "That's good," she said quietly. "Yes." He looked up from the fire and found her eyes across it. "It is." They slept on opposite sides of the fire with propriety and practicality in equal measure. And in the morning they were back in the saddle before the sun cleared the eastern rim of the land, riding toward Cheyenne with the documents and the Bible and a between-them quiet that had changed quality overnight without either of them having done anything to change it. The second day of riding, the conversation went deeper without either of them apparently deciding to go deeper. It was the effect of distance and landscape, Lillian would think later. You ran out of the surface things and had to go further down or be silent, and neither of them were people who chose silence as avoidance. He told her about Walt Gaines, how they had met as ranch hands on a big operation in Colorado, how Walt had the personality that balanced Stephen's, louder, quicker to laugh, generous with his opinions and his attention. How Walt had died on a Tuesday afternoon from a rattlesnake bite they hadn't known was serious until it was too late. How the ranch felt different afterward, not worse exactly, but permanently altered. The way a landscape looks after a fire has come through it, the bones of the place still there, but the texture changed. "Do you get lonely?" she asked, because they had apparently arrived at the point where she could ask that. He considered it. "Not lonely the way I was afraid I would be," he said. "The work fills most of the hours, and Harrow Creek has decent people." He paused. "But there are evenings." "Yes," she said. "There are evenings." They looked at each other across the space between their horses and said nothing else for a while, but the nothing else had a great deal in it. They arrived in Cheyenne late in the afternoon of the third day, trail dusty and road worn, and pulling up in front of a livery stable on the main street, with the particular relief of people who have been moving toward something and have finally arrived. Cheyenne in 1882 was a proper city by territorial standards, with brick buildings alongside the wooden ones, a railroad depot that served the Union Pacific, hotels with glass windows, and a population of several thousand that included lawyers, politicians, railroad men, cattle barons, and a sufficient number of ordinary people to make it feel real rather than theatrical. Howard Marsh's Territorial Land Commissioner's office was in a two-story brick building on Capitol Avenue. They presented themselves at 8:30 the following morning, after a night at a proper hotel where Lillian had slept in a real bed for the first time in a week and woken up feeling more herself than she had since Jefferson City. Marsh was a compact, efficient man in his 50s who had the look of someone who dealt with land disputes every week and had developed a finely tuned sense for which ones were genuine and which were manufactured. He listened to Lillian without interrupting, examined the Bible's front cover, read Clara's letter, looked at both versions of the deed, and compared the registration numbers with the territorial records his office kept. He was quiet for a long time after that. "Miss Wells," he said finally, "the registration number on your mother's Bible matches the original filing in our 1869 ledger. The challenge filed 4 years ago by the Crane Land and Cattle Company cited a survey discrepancy that, looking at this survey copy, does not appear to exist." He set down the papers. "I'm going to need to conduct a formal review. That takes 60 days by statute." "60 days is too long," Stephen said. It was the first thing he had said in the meeting. "Crane knows she's here. He'll move against the land." Marsh looked at Stephen steadily. "Mr. Finley, I know who you are and I know what Crane has been doing to small operators in that county. I am bound by statute." He paused. "However, I can issue a provisional notice that freezes the current status of the land during the review period. No one can file additional claims or actions against the parcel while my office investigates. That prevents Crane from doing anything to complicate the title further." "Issue it today?" Lillian asked. "This afternoon," Marsh said, "and I would like you to leave the original documents with me. I'll give you certified copies." They left Marsh's office 2 hours later with certified copies of everything and an official provisional notice stamped with the territorial seal. Lillian stood on the sidewalk outside the building with the documents in her hand and felt something decompress in her chest that had been wound tight since the night her mother pressed the Bible into her hands. Stephen was standing beside her. She looked up at him. "It's not done," he said, reading something in her expression. 60 days is a long time and Crane is not a patient man." "I know," she said, "but it's something." She held up the provisional notice. "This is something real." He looked at the paper and then at her face. The afternoon light of Cheyenne was warm and ordinary on both of them, and she was aware of how close they were standing and that neither of them had moved apart. "It's real," he agreed quietly. They ate dinner that evening at a proper restaurant, the kind that had tablecloths and a woman playing a small upright piano in the corner. And it was the first time either of them had eaten a meal that was not trail food or hotel stew in several days, and the oddly civilized setting made everything feel slightly different, more deliberate, more aware of itself. He had changed his coat for a cleaner one, and she had put on the other dress she'd brought, a blue one that was better than the traveling dress but still practical, and they sat across from each other at a corner table and looked at menus and talked about things that had nothing to do with land disputes, just because they could. He discovered she had read more books than he expected and fewer romances than he supposed. She discovered he had opinions about politics that were carefully thought out, and that he did not hold them the way men sometimes held opinions, as shields against having to listen. He thought the railroad had been necessary, and its treatment of the workers who built it had been a moral failure. He thought the cattle barons were pushing small ranchers off land they had as much right to as anyone, and that this would eventually break something important about the territory. "Does that include Crane?" she asked. "Crane is a symptom," he said, "not the disease. The disease is the assumption that wealth entitles you to the ground other people stand on." She looked at him across the tablecloth. "My mother would have liked you," she said. He met her eyes. In the candlelight of the restaurant, he looked less like a man managing a difficult situation, and more like a man who had not had enough evenings like this and was feeling the weight of that. "Tell me more about her," he said. So Lillian talked about Clara Wells, and she did it without the throat-tightening effort it had required before, without the sense that she was handling something that might break. She talked about her mother's handwriting, which was the most precise she had ever seen. About the way Clara corrected her students without making them feel small. About the fact that Clara had known every student she had ever taught for the rest of her life and asked after them when she saw them as adults. About how she had loved George Wells with the kind of steady, undramatic devotion that doesn't make good stories but sustains actual lives. Stephen listened and did not look away, and somewhere in the telling Lillian felt her mother become, for the first time since she died, something more than a loss, something complete. They rode back toward Harrow Creek the following morning. The return journey felt different in the way that journeys back always feel different from journeys out, the country familiar now, the miles known. But the difference was also internal, and they both knew it, though neither said so yet. On the second day back, with Harrow Creek a day's ride ahead, they stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing, and Stephen said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him over her horse's withers. "Ask." "When the review is done and the land is confirmed yours," he said, "what are you planning to do with it?" She had thought about this, but saying it aloud to him felt different than thinking it. "Build on it," she said. "My father paid for it honestly. My mother kept it in good faith. I'm not going to let it sit unused." She paused. "I can teach. There's no school south of Harrow Creek. The families out there send their children into town or do without. There's a half-dozen families within riding distance of that parcel," he said. "Been hoping someone would open a school there for 2 years. She watched his face. "You planned this," she said, not quite an accusation. "No," he said immediately. "No, I didn't. I didn't know who you were until the night you sat down across from me." He held her gaze. "But I've been watching that land sit empty for 3 years, and hoping whoever rightfully owned it would show up and do something worth doing with it." She believed him. She believed him in the way she believed things when they aligned with everything she already knew about a person, not through a single statement but through the whole accumulated evidence of how someone moved through the world. "I was not expecting any of this," she said. She meant the land, the trip to Cheyenne, the provisional notice, all of it, but she also meant him and the way he listened and the evenings and the particular sensation of not being alone with something enormous. "Neither was I," he said. He was standing very still beside his horse, holding the reins loosely, looking at her with an expression that had dropped every layer of careful management and was simply present. Lillian. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it in a register she had not felt anything in for a long time. "Yes," she said, very quietly, though he had not actually asked anything yet. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that was somehow more serious than force. And he kissed her in the full afternoon light beside a creek in Wyoming, with the horses blowing softly beside them and the land open in every direction. And she reached up and held his forearms and kissed him back with everything she had kept behind the composed face since her mother died. When they pulled apart, they stood with their foreheads almost touching, and he said, "I have no right to make you any promises until the land is settled. I want you to know that." "You have the right to make honest promises," she said. "The land settling doesn't change what I already know about you." "What do you know about me?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. She considered it. "That you are steady," she said. "That you listen. That you help me not because you needed something from me, even though you did need something from me, but because it was right. That you talked about Walt Gaines like a man who loves the people in his life without needing them to perform that love back." She paused. "That you asked what was written inside my mother's Bible without trying to read it first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I've been waiting for someone I didn't have to explain myself to." "I think so have I," she said. They rode the rest of the way back to Harrow Creek in a state that was not entirely comfortable, because it was new and large and neither of them entirely knew what to do with it. But it was not unhappy. It was the discomfort of something beginning, which is a different thing entirely from the discomfort of something going wrong. The news that Lillian Wells had filed a formal challenge with the Territorial Land Commissioner's office arrived in Harrow Creek before they did, courtesy of a wire Marsh's office had sent to Sheriff Briggs confirming the provisional notice, which meant Aldous Crane knew before they crossed the town limit. Crane came to the Harrow house the morning after their return. He did not come in anger, at least not visible anger. He came the way men who are accustomed to winning come to situations they intend to win, with a kind of easy certainty that the room will arrange itself around them. He was a large man, broad-shouldered in his late 50s, with the tanned, weathered face of someone who had spent decades outdoors, and the soft, expensive coat of someone who had stopped needing to work in them. He had a lawyer with him, a narrow man named Tolliver who carried a leather satchel. Lillian received them in Mrs. Bower's small front parlor, which was the most formal room the Harrow house offered. She sat straight in the chair that most approximated dignity. The Bible was on the table beside her. She had not planned to have the Bible visible, but she had brought it from her room out of habit, and she decided afterward that she was glad it was there. Stephen was not in the room. He had offered to be, and she had said no, that she needed to handle this first part herself, and he had accepted that without argument, which confirmed several things she already believed about him. Crane sat across from her and looked at her with the particular assessing look of a man who was deciding where to apply pressure. Then he looked at the Bible. "Miss Wells," he said, "I won't pretend we haven't heard about your mother. Our condolences." "Thank you," she said without warmth. "I also won't pretend I don't know what you filed with Marsh's office." He folded his hands. "I'm going to be direct with you. That parcel has had Crane cattle on it for 4 years. We've improved the fence lines. We've maintained the river access. We've put value into that land that a vacant title never did. A legal ruling against my claim would be disruptive to a great many things. Then you should have verified that the original title was genuinely vacant before you built on it," she said. Tolliver the lawyer cleared his throat. "Miss Wells, the dispute filed against the Wells deed was based on legitimate concerns about the survey methodology used in 1869. Mr. Crane's claim was made in good faith. Mr. Tolliver," she said, "I have the original survey in my possession. I also have the registration record from the Jefferson City Territorial Office, and I have a provisional notice from Commissioner Marsh that freezes the current status of the land while a formal review is conducted." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Crane. "You filed a false dispute. You knew the deed was valid because if you didn't know it was valid, you wouldn't have bothered to dispute it. A survey that was actually fraudulent wouldn't be worth disputing." A silence fell in the parlor. Crane's easy certainty had acquired a slight, tight quality at the edges. "What do you want?" he asked. She had thought about this. She had thought about it on the second day riding back while Stephen was quiet beside her and the land rolled past. "I want what my father filed for and my mother kept faith with for 13 years, she said. 700 acres south of Harrow Creek, the deed confirmed by the territorial commissioner, and I want you to remove your cattle and your fences from that land within 30 days of the final ruling." "And the Finley matter?" Crane asked. It came out slightly sharper than he'd intended. "Is none of your business," she said. "Mr. Finley's land is his own matter." Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the Bible again, and she had the sudden sense that he was reading something in the fact of it, in the fact that she had come all this way with nothing but her mother's faith and a book full of evidence, and that whatever he read made him recalculate something. "The review will cost you 60 days, he said. "I'll make you an offer. $2,000 for the claim. You take the money, you go back to Missouri. No one has to wait 60 days. $2,000 was a significant amount of money in 1882. Lillian looked at him and thought of her mother's voice, thin and precise in the last days, saying the land belonged to them, saying never let anyone say otherwise. She said. He left without the drama she had half expected. Tolliver followed him, satchel under his arm. The door of the Harrow house closed behind them, and Mrs. Bauer appeared in the hallway looking both impressed and nervous, and Lillian sat in the front parlor with her hands in her lap and waited for her heartbeat to steady. Stephen appeared from the back of the hotel, where Mrs. Bauer had apparently installed him with coffee and a clear line of sight to the front door. "He offered money," Stephen said. $2,000, she confirmed, "and you said no." "I said no." He crossed the parlor and sat in the chair Crane had vacated, and he looked at her for a moment with that full attention that she had come to understand was one of the things she was most going to think about for the rest of her life, and then he said, "What do you need from me today?" She loved him for asking it exactly that way. "I need you to take me out to the land," she said. "I want to walk the boundary. I want to know the actual ground." They rode out that afternoon and walked the perimeter of the Wells parcel for 2 hours, with Stephen narrating the landmarks from the survey copy and Lillian recognizing, again and again, her father's precise observation of the land's features, the creek bend, the rock outcropping, the natural swale that ran south to north and collected water. "He walked every foot of it," she said at one point, looking at a notation in the survey about a particular stand of cottonwoods. "He described this tree stand." She touched the nearest trunk. He was standing here. Stephen was beside her. He reached out and put his hand briefly over hers on the bark of the tree and said nothing, and that was exactly the right thing. The 60 days of the review passed in a life that was more full than Lillian had expected. She stayed in Harrow Creek, earning her room and board by helping Mrs. Bauer with accounts, and taking on a tutoring arrangement with 3 of the town's children whose parents were pleased to have schooling available in the summer. She wrote long letters to Marsh's office, answering every question his investigators sent. She wrote a letter to the Jefferson City clerk her mother had named, who wrote back promptly with a notarized statement confirming George Wells's original deed filing, which she forwarded to Cheyenne by the next post. She saw Stephen most days. He rode in from the ranch every few days on business and stopped at the Harrow house, and sometimes they walked, and sometimes they sat in Mrs. Bauer's front parlor, and sometimes they simply rode out to look at the land together because they both found that it settled something in them, the looking at the land. He brought her things from the ranch without making a ceremony of it. Wildflowers once, which he clearly found embarrassing to present, and she clearly found delightful. A book of poetry by Longfellow he had pulled from his own shelf, saying he thought she might like it, and he'd already read it twice. Fresh peaches from a tree he kept on the sheltered south side of his ranch house that were so good she sat still for a moment after the first one as if in reverence, which made him look extraordinarily pleased. She read to him from the Longfellow sometimes in the evenings in the parlor, and he listened with the quality of attention he gave to everything, and occasionally he said a line back to her from memory, and she would realize he had been quietly reading along in his head. "You've read more than you let on," she said one evening. "I read a lot in winter," he said. "There's not much else to do after 9 o'clock. "What do you read?" "History mostly, some poetry. I've read the Bible through twice." He glanced at the volume on the table beside her, Not the way you carry yours. How do I carry mine? He thought about it. Like it's a conversation you're still having, he said. Not a closed book. She looked at him across the lamp. You pay very close attention, she said. To you, he said simply. She felt heat rise in her face and did not look away from him, and he looked back at her with the steadiness that was becoming one of the landmarks of her internal landscape, the way the cottonwoods and the creek bend were the landmarks of the Wells parcel. Crane was not passive during the 60 days. He worked through legal channels, filing a counter-response with Marsh's office that his lawyers had made as complex and time-consuming as possible, demanding additional surveys and witnesses and correspondence that required Lillian to spend hours composing responses. He did not move directly against the land while the provisional notice was active, because that would have made the violation clear to Marsh. What he did instead was pressure. He withdrew a contract he had with the general store in Harrow Creek that accounted for a significant portion of the store's revenue, and the storekeeper, whose name was Holt, became noticeably cold toward Lillian whenever she came in. He spread a story through town that the Wells deed was forged, which some people believed and some didn't, but which made the social fabric of Harrow Creek uncomfortable in the way that small-town social fabric becomes uncomfortable when a powerful man has decided to make someone unwelcome. Lillian did not crumble under it. She was her mother's daughter, and Clara Wells had spent 30 years being precise and capable in the face of things that tried to diminish her. But there were evenings when the isolation of it pressed in, when she sat in her room with the Bible and felt the distance between herself and everyone who had known her before, and the grief of her mother pressed back in through the edges. On one of those evenings, she went looking for Stephen and found him sitting on the front step of the Harrow house with his hat in his hands, clearly having arrived and found the door closed and decided to wait rather than knock. She sat down beside him on the step without saying anything, close enough that their shoulders touched. He shifted slightly to accommodate her and then was still. "Bad day," she said, not a question. "Crane pulled 2 of my seasonal hands," he said. Offered them work on his spread. They took it. He was quiet. "I'm not angry at them. They need wages, but it leaves me short." "I'm sorry," she said. "I'll manage." He turned his head to look at her. Holt wouldn't sell me flour today," she said. Said he was out. He had flour on the shelf behind him. Something moved across Stephen's face that was not comfortable to look at. "I should go and speak to Holt." "No," she said immediately. "Don't. It'll make it worse. Crane wants us reacting. He wants us to look like we're causing trouble." He looked at her. "You're very calm about this." "I am not calm," she said precisely. "I am controlled. There is a difference and it costs considerably more." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed, not a polite social laugh but a real one, sudden and genuine, and it was such a different sound than his usual careful composure that she felt it like warmth. "I like you enormously," he said, when the laugh had settled. She was very glad of the evening dark because she felt her face doing something she could not entirely manage. "I like you enormously as well," she said, and left it at that. And they sat on the step together as Harrow Creek went about its evening business around them, and the stars came out over Wyoming in their particular abundance. He kissed her properly for the first time since the creek crossing later that evening, standing at the top of the hotel's outside stairs, and this time it was less surprised and more deliberate, and she held the front of his coat in both hands and kissed him back with the full force of everything she was, and felt him breathe in as if she were oxygen. The 60-day review concluded on a Thursday in August. The ruling came by wire to Sheriff Briggs's office, with a certified letter following by post, and Briggs came to the Harrow house himself to tell Lillian, which she later thought was as decent a thing as Briggs had done in their acquaintance. The Wells land grant was confirmed valid. The Crane dispute was found to have been filed without sufficient evidence, and the counterclaim was dismissed. The Crane Land and Cattle Company was ordered to remove its cattle and any structures built on the Wells parcel within 45 days. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office formally registered Lillian Rose Wells as the legal owner of 700 acres on the Powder River Branch, south of Harrow Creek, Johnson County, Wyoming Territory. Lillian read the wire 3 times. Then she opened her mother's Bible to the front cover and read her father's deed registration number and her mother's handwritten note. George paid for this ground with 6 years of savings and an honest hand. It is ours. Never let anyone say otherwise. And she sat down in Mrs. Bower's front parlor with the Bible in her lap and let herself cry, finally, for all the things that the tears were about. Her father's honest hand, her mother's patient faith, the 13 years of a deed kept in a Bible as an act of hope, the 600 miles and the grief and the longing and the fear, all of it releasing now because there was finally room. Stephen arrived at the hotel an hour later, having gotten word at the ranch by a different route. He found her in the parlor, composed again, with the wire on the table in front of her and the Bible beside it. He sat down and read the wire and then looked at her. "It's yours," he said. "It's mine," she said. And then she looked at him, and everything she felt was probably visible on her face, because she had used up all her composed resources on the tears and had nothing left to manage her expression with. "Thank you, for all of it, for the survey copy and the wire to Marsh and the riding to Cheyenne and every single evening in this parlor." "Lillian," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand. His was large and warm and roughened from work, and it held hers with the precise firmness of something meaning to hold on. "I need to ask you something." She looked at his hand holding hers and then at his face. "I know you've only been in Wyoming 2 months, he said. "And you've spent those 2 months managing a legal battle and a grief and a displacement all at once, and you are the most composed and capable and quietly extraordinary person I have ever met in my life, and I'm aware that I am asking this too soon by any conventional measure." "Ask it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Stay," he said. "Build the school you talked about. Build the house you deserve on the land your father paid for, and let me be near to whatever you build for as long as you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was on the table as always. The Bible was between them as always. Outside, Harrow Creek went about its business. The land that was hers now lay south of town in the late August heat, waiting. "Are you asking me to court you properly?" she said. "Or are you asking something further along than that?" The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm trying to respect the sequence," he said. "But the truth is that I know what I'm asking. I'm asking whether there's a future where I am in your life as the most permanent fixture in it." "That is a very careful way of proposing," she said. "I'm trying not to frighten you." "I am not frightened," she said. She turned her hand under his so that she was holding his as firmly as he was holding hers. "I came west with my mother's Bible and found the man who asked what was written inside it, who asked me to say the words instead of show the paper, who built a fire and fed me hardtack on a trail to Cheyenne, who listened to me talk about my mother and made her feel real again." She pressed his hand. "I am not frightened. I am certain." Something in him shifted then, some last held thing releasing, and he looked at her with an expression she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. "Then I'm asking," he said. "Then I'm saying yes," she said. He came around the table, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her the way you hold something you have been careful with, and do not intend to be careless with now. And she leaned into it with the full weight of everything she had carried alone across 600 miles. And the Bible sat open on the table behind them, and the lamp burned, and the Wyoming evening pressed blue against the windows. They were married in October of 1882, on a Saturday when the cottonwoods along the Powder River had gone gold, and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of fall. Sheriff Briggs served as a witness, which surprised everyone including Briggs. Mrs. Bower provided a wedding cake that was dense and honest and excellent. The ceremony was held at the small Methodist church in Harrow Creek, conducted by a minister named Aldrich who had a warm voice and did not make the service longer than it needed to be. Lillian wore the blue dress, the good one, with a borrowed veil from Mrs. Bower's younger daughter, who had been married 3 years ago, and kept her veil as a kind of civic resource for future occasions. She carried her mother's Bible in addition to a small bunch of wild asters that Stephen had somehow procured without explaining how. Stephen wore a dark coat she had not seen before and looked at her when she came down the church aisle with an expression that made the minister clear his throat gently to get his attention back. She stood beside him at the altar and thought of her mother keeping a deed in a Bible for 13 years as an act of faith. She thought of her father standing among the cottonwoods, measuring a piece of land with honest hands. She thought of 600 miles and a long table in a small hotel dining room and a fire beside a creek and a Bible hitting a dirt floor, and the specific way Stephen Finley listened when she talked. When Aldrich said his piece about love and faith and two people choosing each other in the face of everything uncertain, she felt the truth of it in a register deeper than sentiment. This was a choice made from full knowledge. He knew what she carried. She knew what he carried. They had been honest with each other from the first night, which was not always how love began but was, she thought, the best way. She said yes when she was meant to say yes. He said yes when he was meant to say yes. They were married in front of 11 people in a Wyoming October afternoon, and when he kissed her, the small congregation offered a sound that was surprised and warm. They moved to Powder Creek Ranch after the wedding, into the house Stephen had built with Walt Gaines, which had 4 rooms and good windows and a wide covered porch that looked south toward the Wells parcel. He had added a 5th room in September while the review was still proceeding, not saying why, and she had not asked, understanding. In the first weeks of their marriage, she learned the rhythms of the ranch, which were earlier and later than anything she had kept before, and she learned the names of the 2 cowhands, Denny and a Shoshone man named James who had worked with Stephen for 2 years, who spoke 3 languages and was the most efficient rider she had ever seen. She learned that Stephen woke at 5 in any weather without needing to be woken, that he made the morning coffee with a seriousness that deserved respect, that he kept a small shelf of books in the bedroom and read for half an hour every night before sleeping. She brought her own books. They combined the shelves and rearranged them by subject and argued pleasantly about whether history or poetry should come first, and this argument became a recurring and somewhat beloved feature of their life together. She began building the school in the spring. The parcel's land gave her both the site and the timber to build with, and Stephen organized the building as a community project, sending word to the families south of town whose children needed schooling. And on 3 consecutive Saturdays in April, a dozen people showed up with tools and opinion and a willingness to work, and the schoolhouse went up on a rise that caught the southern light through its 4 good windows. It was a single room with 16 desks, a chalkboard, a stove for winter, and a shelf for books that Lillian had been collecting since she decided to do this. The first day of school in September of 1883, 11 children arrived, ranging from 6 to 14, some of them speaking more Spanish than English because their families were of Mexican origin who had come up from the south, some of them speaking the Shoshone of their families, all of them looking at her with the frank, assessing attention of children deciding whether an adult is worth listening to. She was her mother's daughter. She knew how to teach. She taught arithmetic and reading and geography and the letters of the Spanish and English alphabets. And when she found that 2 of her students were more comfortable in Spanish, she got herself a Spanish-English dictionary from the post-order catalog and learned alongside them. She kept records with her mother's precision, knew each child's particular strength and difficulty, and believed in their capability the way Clara had believed in her students, with a faith that did not require perfect results to sustain itself. Stephen came by the schoolhouse at the end of most school days. He did not interrupt. He sometimes sat on the step outside and waited, listening through the window, and she would look up from helping a student and see his shadow on the wooden floor from the afternoon sun and feel the specific warmth of being known. Crane left them alone. The ruling had been clear and Marsh's office had made it clear that further interference would be treated as contempt. Crane was also, by 1883, facing challenges from other directions, competing cattle operations moving in from the north, a drought affecting his southern pastures, and a series of business disputes that occupied his lawyers. He did not have the energy for a fight he had already lost. The world in that corner of Wyoming did not transform overnight. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ongoing reality of life in a place that had not yet finished deciding what it was going to be. The cattle markets shifted and held and shifted again. There were disputes with neighbors over water rights that required patience and sometimes lawyers. There were illnesses and accidents, the ordinary difficult weather of life in a place where the land did not apologize for its demands. But there was also the specific and daily reality of a life built with intention. Stephen was the kind of partner who showed up in the small moments as fully as in the large ones, who noticed when she was tired and said so without being asked, who remembered things she had said weeks ago and brought them back when they were relevant. He was not effusive, but he was present, and presence, Lillian came to understand, was the most sustaining form of love. She was present in return. She learned the ranch's rhythms. She learned when to be beside him during the hard stretches, and when to let him be quiet with the difficulty. She learned that he sometimes went to stand at the edge of the north pasture in the evening not because anything was wrong but because the open horizon settled something in him, and she went with him sometimes and stood beside him without speaking, which was its own kind of fluency. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, which was where most of the honest things in their life got said, over coffee in the morning, with the early light coming through the east window. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved through surprise and into something so full she could not name all of it. Then he stood up and came around the table and held her face in his hands the way he had that first afternoon by the creek, with the careful, intentional gentleness of a man who knew the value of what he was holding. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was Stephen. "I am very all right," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then stood with his arms around her for a long time in the kitchen, while the coffee went cold, and the morning came fully through the window and neither of them moved. Their son was born in November of 1884. They named him George, after Lillian's father. George Wells Finley arrived in the middle of a November snowstorm, with a voice that made clear opinions about the transition, and was pink and furious and healthy, and Stephen held him with the particular stillness of a man who has been steady through many things, and is now confronting something that has made all of it feel like preparation. Lillian watched Stephen hold his son and thought of her father walking the land below, and of her mother keeping faith in a book, and of everything that had found its way forward through the years to arrive at this particular room on this particular November night. "He looks like you," Stephen said. "He looks like a person who has been inconvenienced," Lillian said, which was the first time she had made Stephen laugh since labor began, and the sound of it in the bedroom was one of the best sounds she had heard in her life. George was not a quiet infant but was a healthy one, and grew into a child with his father's dark hair and his mother's precise attention, and a disposition toward the outdoors that required constant supervision near the river. Mrs. Bauer, who had become something close to family in the way that people who witness your important moments become family, rode out on Sundays for dinner and brought George small gifts that he received with enormous gravity. James, the Shoshone cowhand, taught George to track animals by their prints in the mud along the riverbank when George was 4, and this information George regarded as the most valuable he had ever received, which made James laugh in the specific way of a man who has been genuinely honored. The school grew. By 1886, it had 17 students and a second teacher, a young woman named Rosa Martinez who had come from New Mexico and taught the Spanish-speaking children with a warmth and exactitude that Lillian admired enormously. They divided the subjects between them and argued about pedagogy in the way that two people argue when they respect each other, and both care intensely about the outcome. Stephen hired 2 more hands and expanded the herd, and built a second barn and drove fencing along the northern boundary, and was, in the estimation of anyone who observed it, a man who was working towards something he intended to last. He was also, in the privacy of their life, unexpectedly funny, with a dry and precise humor that emerged in certain moments and made Lillian laugh in a way that felt like relief, the specific laughter of someone being allowed to be delighted. In the evenings, after George was in bed and the ranch was quiet, they sat with books or letters or conversation, and sometimes she read to him from whatever she was reading, and sometimes he talked about the ranch or the territory or something he'd been thinking about. And sometimes they were simply quiet together in the way of people who have learned that their silences are companionable rather than empty. He still occasionally asked about the Bible. Not about the legal documents inside it, which had long since been filed and confirmed and were no longer necessary to carry. He asked about what she read in it, what she thought, whether she found the same things her mother had found. These conversations had the quality of the best conversations, the ones that did not have conclusions, that opened into further questions and lived there comfortably. She kept the Bible on her nightstand. The letter her mother had written was still inside the front cover. She had taken it out and read it more than once in the years since coming to Wyoming, and it no longer felt like handling something fragile. It felt like her mother's voice, as Clara had intended, precise and clear and affectionate, saying the things she had needed to say and trusting her daughter to carry them forward. She trusted them forward. In the fall of 1887, Lillian discovered she was expecting a second child. This one arrived in April of 1888, a daughter, who came quickly and with somewhat more composure than George had managed. They named her Clara, and she had her grandmother's eyes, the sharp, dark, interested eyes of someone who would look at the world and decide to know it properly. George was 3.5 and received his sister with a mixture of genuine interest and carefully managed suspicion that resolved over the following weeks into a fierce protectiveness that would become one of the organizing facts of both their childhoods. He brought Clara objects he considered valuable, a smooth river stone, a feather, his most prized marble, and arranged them beside her as an offering, and this too made Lillian think of her mother and of what it meant to pass things of value forward. The winter of 1888 was hard. Wyoming winters in that decade had a way of being hard without apology. The cattle were brought down to the lower pastures. The schoolhouse closed for 6 weeks in January and February, when the cold was dangerous to ride in, and the Powder Creek Ranch held itself together through the work of people who knew what they were doing and did not stop doing it. In the long evenings of that winter, with the children asleep and the wind off the open land pressing at the windows, Lillian and Stephen sat by the fire and read and talked and played cards when they were in the mood for it. And the quality of their closeness in those months was different from the closeness of summer, deeper and more interior, the closeness of people who have been through enough together to have stopped performing anything. She told him, one of those February nights, that she had written a letter to Marsh's office in Cheyenne recommending that the Territorial Land Commissioner develop a clearer process for protecting individual land grants from corporate disputes, citing her own case as evidence of the vulnerability in the current system. She had spent most of a week drafting it and had sent it 3 days ago. He looked at her across the fire. "You're going to change the policy," he said. "Not a question." "I'm going to try," she said. "My mother shouldn't have spent 9 years afraid to claim what was hers because the process was unclear and Crane was larger than she was." "No," he agreed. "She shouldn't have." Marsh's office wrote back in April. The letter said her recommendations had been noted and forwarded to the territorial legislature for consideration in the next session. It was not a commitment, but it was a note in the record, and notes in records had a way of becoming precedent if you persisted, which she intended to do. Stephen read the letter and said, "George Wells's daughter doing survey work of a different kind." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Your father mapped the land," he said. "You're mapping the law, making it accurate so other people can find their way." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to write that in my mother's Bible." "Write it in your own," he said. "Start your own." She looked at him. The fire was behind him and the lamp on the table was between them, and the house was quiet with sleeping children, and she felt the full scope of what had been built in the 5 years since she had walked into Harrow Creek with $23 and a carpet bag and a mother's Bible full of faith and documents. "I'll need a new Bible," she said. "Mrs. Bauer's daughter knows a good bookseller in Cheyenne," he said, as if this were the obvious practical response, and it was, and she loved him enormously for it. She got the Bible. She started writing in it. The first thing she wrote in the inside front cover in her mother's schoolteacher script, because she had learned her handwriting from Clara and kept it, was this: "This land is ours. My father paid for it honestly. My mother kept faith with it. My husband fought beside me for it. My children will grow up on it. May whoever comes after us find it worthy of the faith." Beneath that she wrote, "George Ezra Finley, born November 14, 1884. Clara Rose Finley, born April 3, 1888. She left space below for what might come, because she was her mother's daughter and she believed in keeping space for what came next." The life of Powder Creek Ranch and the Wells School continued and grew through the end of the decade and into the 1890s. George grew into a boy who was methodical and curious, who helped with the cattle and helped in the schoolroom with equal willingness. Clara grew into a girl who had opinions and expressed them with a precision that made Lillian think every single day of her mother, who would have loved her granddaughter with the full force of everything she'd kept composed in her years. Stephen's brother Edmund came to visit in 1889, bringing his wife Sarah and their 2 young children, and stayed for 3 weeks, and there was a quality in those 3 weeks of a family finding its full shape. Old estrangements properly resolved by presence and honest conversation, and the particular clarity that comes from watching someone you love be happy in the life they chose. Edmund said on his last evening, sitting on the wide porch with the south pasture visible in the failing light, "You built something real out here." "Lillian built most of it," Stephen said. "He is being modest," Lillian said. "We built it." Edmund looked at them both and smiled the smile of a younger brother who has worried about his older brother for a long time and has recently been allowed to stop. The land dispute case eventually did influence territorial policy. In 1891, the Wyoming Territorial Legislature passed a statute requiring additional verification for any corporate challenge to an individual land deed filed prior to 1875, specifically citing the need to protect early filers from retroactive disputes. The statute was dry and technical and would not make interesting reading for most people, but Lillian read it 3 times and kept a copy of it in her new Bible beside the children's birth dates and the note she had written about the land. She wrote another note beneath the statute copy. "This is for my mother, who was right." By 1892, they had a 3rd child, a 2nd son named Ezra, after Stephen's uncle who had kept George Wells's survey copy for 13 years because he thought the land was worth remembering. Ezra came into the world as a mild-tempered and contented infant who regarded his older siblings with a benevolent interest and grew into a boy of the same disposition, which meant he was the peacemaker in an otherwise opinionated household and was loved by everyone for it. Lillian taught for 15 years at the South Creek Schoolhouse until she handed the full teaching duties to Rosa Martinez, who had become both her colleague and one of her closest friends, and took on the role of school board chair, overseeing the expansion of education in the county south of Harrow Creek, and advocating with the Territorial Education Office for resources and teacher training. Stephen expanded the ranch and then, deliberately and with characteristic intention, stopped expanding when it reached the size that was manageable by the people who worked it rather than the size that would require treating it like a corporation. He said once that he had watched what the desire for bigger and bigger had done to men in this territory, and he had decided he would rather have a ranch that worked right than a ranch that was impressive. She loved him for that specific choice, the way she loved him for many specific choices, with the particular warmth of recognizing someone's values in their actions rather than just in their words. The house grew too, incrementally, a room for each child, a proper kitchen added in 1890, a porch on the east side that caught the morning light, a study that was technically for bookkeeping but functioned mostly as a library where both of them read and left each other notes in the margins of books the way other people left letters. One evening in the late summer of 1893, Stephen found her on the south porch of the ranch house as the sun went down over the land. She had the new Bible in her lap and she was looking out at the Wells parcel, which had become part of the fabric of the ranch's life and was no longer a disputed place but simply theirs, the school on its rise, the river catching the last light through the cottonwoods, the grass she had walked with her father in mind on the first day Stephen brought her out here. He sat down beside her and said nothing for a while, which was a thing they had perfected over 11 years of marriage. Then he said, "What are you thinking?" She looked at him. His hair had a gray thread in it now, and his face was settled and familiar and still the most honest face she had looked at across a table or a fire or a saddle in her life. "I'm thinking about my mother on her deathbed pressing this into my hands," she said, touching the Bible's cover, "and how frightened she was and how she sent me anyway, and how she was right about every single thing." "She was right about every single thing," he agreed. "She never saw this," Lillian said. "She looked at the land and the school and the house and the evening. But she made all of it possible. She kept the deed in the Bible for 13 years because she believed it was worth keeping. And then she sent me to keep it, and I came out here and found you, and you asked what was written inside it. I wanted to know," he said. "Everything about you felt worth knowing from the first evening." She looked at him with the full warmth of 11 years and 3 children, and the land and the school and the statute, and all the specific accumulated evidence of a life built with someone who showed up in every dimension of it. "My mother would have said," she told him, "that you were the best thing on the other side of her faith." He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had across the table in the Harrow house parlor with the same intention, and held it. "Your mother," he said, "was the wisest woman in Missouri." She laughed and leaned into his shoulder, and the evening went gold over the Powder River land that had waited 13 years for someone to claim it honestly, and the school stood on its rise in the last light. And inside the house, George was arguing about something with Clara in the specific way of siblings who are also genuinely fond of each other. And Ezra was probably mediating with the patient competence that was his signature. And the cottonwoods along the river caught the wind and turned their silver sides to the sky. The Bible on her lap held everything that mattered: her mother's note and her father's registration number, the children's births, the statute copy, her own note about the land, and space still below for what was still to come, because she was 56 years, if she was lucky and careful, from being old, and this land and this life and this man were hers, confirmed and certain and ongoing, as her father had surveyed the ground and her mother had kept the faith, and she had carried it west and found it true. She had come west with her mother's Bible and found a rancher who asked what was written inside it, and what was written inside it was everything, and everything had been enough to build a life from, and the life had become exactly what her mother's faith had always been reaching toward. Across 13 years and 600 miles, and all the uncertain ground between a deed and a Bible, and a woman sitting on a porch in the Wyoming evening with her husband's hand in hers, and the land stretching golden in the last of the day's light, fully and finally and irrevocably home.